Okay, well, this lecture is on graphic communication, which is also part of business communication. In fact, it's part of every kind of document-based communication, and certainly part of every thing that we write. Writing is visible. It is graphic. In fact, the terms for graph, graphe, graphic, those all mean writing in Greek. So when we talk about graphic communication, we are by definition talking about written communication, but we're talking about more than that. We're talking about visual communication. So we're talking about the structure behind the visual order, and at some point as writers, you will have to consider, if not communicate about, typography and the look and outward presentation of your text. So tonight we're just going to very quickly go through some of the concepts that lie behind a notion of visual order and some basic typographic terms. In the next courses, we're going to look more in detail at this. We're going to look at the display of quantitative information and some other design elements, and we're going to look at the design of things like instructions, which really matter to the user trying to get something done quickly. But it's true for all communication, and particularly for all business communication, that graphics are really important, that design is really, really important. And you can mess that up too. So let's go through some of this, and we'll end by going over the typography outline that I've got on the website. Okay. Trivia. We're going to start with some graphic trivia. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with Mickey Mouse. You know, there's some graphic oddities about Mickey Mouse, but it's part of his style. And part of the style of Mickey Mouse is that no matter which way he's pointed, the angle of his two ears, separating them, is always the same. And kind of creepily when you think about it, they're always visible. So it's pretty interesting that Mickey's ears, both of them, are never invisible. He has no profile. As you can see, these the source for this goes back to the 1930s and to Disney's original sketches for Mickey Mouse. But there's a more up-to-date one on the right showing emotions, but also showing all the ways in which Mickey Mouse is a stylized graphic meant to create a certain kind of feeling and not be entirely in the realistic vein. Okay, it's really, really interesting that this has become, I mean, this is the patent office, the trademark office, and these are Walt Disney's original trademarks for his character Mickey. Okay, so both of the ears are always visible at the same angle, regardless of a horizontal perspective. And I gotta say, I've never seen this top version of Mickey either. That is pretty creepy, especially with his hands. And I know they've done some stuff with three-dimension Mickey for video games and stuff that is also really weird. You can Google this and find out. But I just find it fascinating that once you know that his ears are always visible, it always looks a little different than it did before. Okay. So again, what are we going to go over tonight more specifically? Well, we're going to talk about the importance of visual perception. We're going to talk about typography and history a little bit. And then we're going to talk about, as I said, we're going to just go over briefly the typographic terms and explanations that I have out on the website. Okay, so basic typography. I want you to, you probably know a little bit about typography. You use Word or you use a desktop publishing system or something like that. Whoops, and you might actually know already some things about typography. I'm talking with my hands here and I hit the space bar. That's how weird it is lecturing to a computer instead of to you guys. Anyway, just an aside. So I thought it would be interesting to, show you some type. I'm going to show you some type, and I want you to really think about what your initial thoughts on this type are. Okay, quick. Look at these type selections, right? Do they remind you of anything? Does Arnold Bachlin remind you of anything? Or Cable Light? or Data 70? Does that remind you of anything? How about Peño Bold or Calligraphia or Hobo or Avant-Garde Gothic X-Light or Branding? Look at Branding. Look at that one down there. Boy, oh boy, that's a weird looking typeface, isn't it? Now, if you're of a certain age, like I am, these typefaces all resonate with you for evoking a certain kind of time. So if you thought that maybe they were sort of disco-esque, some of these, or they looked like computers over in Data 70, I'm looking at you. Let me just show you this. Yeah, so I can move around a little bit. You see how Data 70 looks like computer type? Well, believe it or not, all these typefaces are from the 1970s. And they're not all originated in the 1970s, but this is called Letraset. This is a Letraset catalog for the kinds of typefaces you would be able to get if you were, making a restaurant or a movie or, doing something with an ad. There's all these kind of wild disco typefaces. Alongside, there's Palatino. It's still in your Mac. There's Avant-Garde. It's still in your Mac. But you don't see much of Baby Teeth these days, or indeed much of Bullion Shadow or Prisma, okay? Let alone Futura Black, although Futura Black's still around. Ekman Schrift, I don't know, maybe the Paris Metro. I don't think so. My point is that this typeface, it has a feeling as well as a reality. Look at these ones. This is from the same catalog, right? Albertus, a very, very conservative and still used typeface. American, looks very Celtic, actually. It doesn't look much American. In fact, it looks like any number of beers or Irish pub signs. Blanchard Solid is a bit weird. And a backslant, whereas brush script is a fairly standard script. Typeface, and charrette, I don't know what charrette is. It looks like it might be stenciled on dynamite. But you can still see this is from the 70s. Look at Bottleneck. I mean, if that isn't a disco typeface, I don't know what is. It's due for a revival. Look at the P's and the Q's there. Look at how heavy the bottom of these things are. In fact, look at the bell bottoms or the flares if you're into fashion. Those are That is such a 70s typeface, it's actually wearing the pants of the 1970s and 80s. It's pretty astonishing. And if you are a Tarantino fan, Quentin Tarantino fan, you might have seen Jackie Brown. Jackie Brown, the movie taking place in the 70s, also uses these kinds of typefaces to evoke the time period and to set an emotional stage. And that's one of the things that typography does. It carries with it the trace, even if you don't know those things are from the time when disco ruled. Even if you don't know anything about the 1970s, which I admit for most of you is as distant as the 1920s in your memory, right? Because you don't have a memory of it, right? Even if you don't know anything about it, those typefaces still carry the trace of those kinds of things. And that's why it's important to know a little bit about typography, right? And a little bit about visual ordering. At the heart of how we order things visually are the same kinds of things that we think about when we think about, sentence focus, emphasis, the given new, and structures. And some of the ways that we structure visual perception is very, very similar to the way we structure language perception, or indeed musical emphasis. These things are the same or similar, and we'll talk more about that in the next class. But you can see strictly visually, when we look at something, we don't necessarily go through this list of Gestalt principles. Gestalt is a psychological evolution and set of ideas that talks about structure and how we understand things. In the visual Gestalt of how these things fit together, we look at things and go, look, is there a shape or is there a symbol into a shape? Does the shape mean something? So I don't have it here, but if I was to show you the shape of a stop sign, an octagon, you'd go, ah, it's an octagon, it's a stop sign, right? Especially if it was red. It wouldn't even have to say stop. You'd still think stop sign, right? Those dots here, closedness, these dots, they're not closed, but your eye closes that shape and makes it into a makes it into a circle, right? And into a single shape, even though it isn't closed. We close it anyway. Area, obviously something smaller is less important than something larger a lot of times. Proximity, when you group things, like, is there anything that says this row of dots and this row of dots should go together? Well, or these two should go together in pairs in this proximity example? Well, the only thing that does is the wider white space between the two quote-unquote sets, and we automatically group those together. Here's similarity and area, right? You can see that, some of these dots are similar, some of these dots are not similar in terms of size. Which is more important? Well, in this case, I would suggest that slightly, anyway, the large dots stand out because they're different. And as we've seen over and over and over again, difference makes meaning. Or at least it's the precondition for meaning making, okay? There is no meaningful difference between these two things, but if I had to make one up, I would make one up around this. Similarity can play a role in grouping things together. So the filled dots are similar, the unfilled dots are similar. Which one's more important? That's a very difficult thing to say because they're equal. So they are different, but not especially so. So that's very, very interesting. And you also have an argument of visual equality here, right? Where you don't here, right? Texture can enhance details, of course. And then, of course, the way we configure the background in the foreground is largely dependent on things like contrast, which, shows, again, a difference in visual either brightness or tonal value or those kinds of things. Those are all differences in contrast. And there's a classic, figure ground optical illusion here with, are those two faces you see, or do you see the vase or the candelabra, right? And it flips back and forth depending on what you focus on. But again, the gestalt of the way this comes together is that it's always and forever ambiguous, as it can be with some other examples. So here's a good one. This is Dali's L'image disparaît, which is both a self-portrait of Salvador Dali, in a way, if you look at it, or it's a woman, pregnant woman, kneeling, right? Which is it? It's one of those undecidable images, right? It's kind of both and neither at the same time. And these are how Gestalt principles help you understand visual meaning, right? You can use proximity, light, shadow, figure, ground to figure out how these work. Here's another one. What do you see in the foreground here? Do you see a naked woman or do you see a cat with a wine glass? Interesting, eh? Which one does your brain actually focus on? Can you unsee the woman? It's very, very difficult sometimes to do that. Here's another great example of closedness. What do you see there? Do you see a dog? There is no dog there. It's just a series of splotches. But your eye fills in the gaps. And yes, this is probably a very low resolution, sort of lithograph almost of a dog. But there is no dog. There is no closeness to his shape or her shape, but you can still see it. Here's a much trickier one. I want you to see if you can find the star in this. Okay? Look at it. There's a 5-pointed star. Have you found it? It's right here. Once you see it, you won't stop seeing it. My mouse is tracing it. Ah! Ah! Let's try that one more time. My mouse is tracing it. Okay? Here it is. Do you see it yet? It's hard because the color red goes across the star. But once you've seen it, right? It's very hard to not see it in this. But does it stand out? No, various contrasts. It's hard to find a figure. It's hard to find a ground, but it is there. Here's another quirk of our visual system. Ask yourself, where does that white line on the left line up with the lines on the right? Most people would guess it either lines up at the bottom of the blue line, right about here, or the top of the red line, right about here. But if you actually look, oh, look at that. See, our brains are not very good at filling in that black space between those lines and drawing a simple straight line from one to the other. That's because we want to look, for straight lines that aren't quite straight. We're not so good at it. Here's another one to show your visual system and its biases. This is a picture of Margaret Thatcher upside down, but actually it isn't. It is this, right? Where her eyes and mouth are literally upside down in the actual right side up picture. But your brain isn't very good at catching that when she's upside down, which should tell you something about how you perceive things, right? Our brains are just not meant to look at people upside down. They're just not. But it's horrific when you see the real thing here. And all I'm doing is flipping this around. I'm not flipping the eyes or the mouth. It's just that it looks perfectly okay, kind of, because of the way we see things when they're misoriented in space. Okay, that's enough of that. So, as I said, let's focus a little bit more on typography here. Our type carries meaning. It also carries a historical tradition, which we've talked about before. It's tied to the alphabet. It's tied to the history and technology of writing. We mentioned before that our capital letters come from Roman stone inscriptions. And here is one Roman stone inscription from Rome, actually, and in the marketplace there. And you can see here is you can see the capital letters here, and you can see that they actually have serifs, right? Where the chisel has finished the letter, right? And serifs are those little chisel marks right there, right? Where my mouse is. Do you see them? You get that from these inscriptions that are carved into stone because the chisel has to finish the letter in that way. And that's where our capital letters come from. They come from this set of Roman engravings, right? And so in our typographic language, you might have wondered why Times New Roman was called Times New Roman. Well, Roman just means regular, that it's a regularly formed sort of historical typeface. And so Times New Roman is the typeface that the London Times used, right? And it's a new version of it, and it's a regular typeface. That's what it means. The capitals are based on these forms from history. Our small letters also come from variants on these forms, and you can see some of them here. In fact, they come from Roman script, right? So people wrote scripts, and that's where our small letters come from. This has also come down in our typography and character set. Here's a character that you know as the ampersand, and you know it means and. Why does it mean and? Where did the ampersand come from? Well, I showed you this in a variety of different typefaces so you could understand where it comes from. I mean, that looks sort of like a treble clef if you're a backwards one maybe, if you're a musician, but it's not a G. It's actually the letters E and T crossed. And here you can really see that. E, T, Latin et, French a, meaning and, right? Here's another one where it's very, very, very easy to see that it's an E and a T. That looks like an 8 and a C, but it's still an E and a T crossed over. Here's another one, even more stylized E with a slash to make a T in the tail. Okay. Some other things that have evolved in the way we represent graphics, and they're different now than they used to be because computers can do this stuff now and they didn't used to be able to. You can see these are called ligatures, where you actually draw the letters as one form together, right? So look at the double F in the italic of this Adobe Jensen font, right? It's a single stroke and the dot actually connects properly. If you look above, you can see where it's done incorrectly, right? This is two discrete letters, right? This is a ligature that binds them together. And this is the proper way to do it, right? Same for this, same for this, right? Similarly, FI here is not correct. That dot is way out of line. It should be right here underneath the F. Okay, same for FL. That's another ligature that gets put together. And you notice the difference in the height of the letter. It's just a little bit different. Similarity, FF does not look the same like double F as a ligature FF, where the crosses are a little bit more put together than they are here. Okay, so that's the history of things. And the moral of the story, of this very brief story, is that you need to choose the appropriate typeface for your message. Do people get that wrong? They get it wrong all the time, right? Now, it's true if you stick to Arial and Times, or if you're on a Mac, Helvetica, and, I don't know what's on a Mac. It must be Times or Palatino or something like that, right? You're not going to go too far wrong. Those are very, very basic typefaces. They're also kind of boring, but you have to be very careful for the one you pick. Most of my slides, for instance, are in a typeface called Gill Sans, designed by Eric Gill in the 1930s. And it's a very, very plain, but also very evocative typeface, and I find it's good for making presentations because Gill designed it that way. This is probably the most hated font in the world, or typeface. This is Comic Sans, which was designed for a bunch of different things, but mainly as a fun typeface that mimics children's handwriting. It's not a serious typeface. It's not a serious typeface to house any type of serious message. By the way, plenty of people have said it's easier to read. It's not easier to read. Plenty of people have said people with autism actually can read this more easily, or people who are dyslexic can read this more easily. And though there are typefaces designed that look a little bit like Comic Sans for people who are dyslexic because they're simplified, it is not Comic Sans. Comic Sans is not easier to read. It's suitable for birthday parties. That's about it. And kids' lemonade sales. But people get this wrong all the time. I still see business communications in Comic Sans. I think the most famous one where the internet sort of blew up, even though it was 2012, internet still blew up, was this one. Back in 2012, when the scientists found at CERN, this is the the particle accelerator, right? Scientific organization that does basic fundamental physics experiments, and they found the Higgs boson, which is called the God particle, quote unquote, right? And they presented their findings, as you can see, in Comic Sans, with a ridiculous kind of blue, white, and yellow, and orange, and red, multicolor background. Again, like they're hiring a clown for a kid's party, not some fundamental historic occasion where they found a fundamental physics particle for the first time. So you can definitely screw this up. Okay, so don't. When in doubt, go for something conservative. But if you really want to match your document with the right typeface, you need to look into the history of the typeface. You can do that at places like Adobe. So with all that said, let's have a look at the graphics that I have for you on the website. And by the way, there's a really good Adobe typographic PDF as well on the website that tells you in much more detail and better explained about things. I'll leave you to explore that on your own, but it's there. In the meantime, let's have a look at this. Yes, we're opening that. Okay. So this is just a cheat sheet, really, about the kinds of things you need to understand if you're going to communicate to anybody about typography. Okay? And the first one is the understanding of font family, and typeface. And look, they're used pretty interchangeably today. They didn't used to be. font used to be something different than font family, which was a computer-centric way of talking about typefaces, but let's just call them interchangeable. I call them typefaces because that includes the entire set of typefaces. Typeface is probably the clearest. So it's a single identifiable design for type. Okay, that's what's really important. And here's some different typefaces, all related to another typeface, all called the Adobe Garamond typeface, or typeface family, or typeface, right? So there's Adobe Garamond Roman. It's a regular typeface. There it is in bold. There it is in italics. There it is in bold, italic, and there's semi-bold. Now, I want you to understand these things are not the same, okay? Italic, which is like a handwritten text, is not just slanted Roman text. It's not just slanted standard. Look at the E. Do you see how much different it is, right, than this E or the B? Do you see the little serifs here? There's no such serif on the B in italics. Perhaps most different, look at the A, right? The A here is completely like handwriting. The A here is like type. And this Garamond is actually a type that goes back to the Renaissance. It's one of the oldest typefaces and to the earliest printed books. So it really does come out of the tradition of handwritten script. Okay? So it's really, really interesting. Yeah, remember, good type, italics, bold, and regular, they're all different, right? They're very different. There are serif and sans serif styles. I think I told you the serif styles over here, they come from those Roman inscriptions. Sans serif, or without serifs, is quite modern, quite a bit more modern, and really date really only to the 20th century. There really aren't sans serif typefaces before the 20th century. Now, if a lot of times people say, a lot of times people say serif typefaces are easier to read, sans serif typefaces are not as easy to read, or vice versa, based on some bogus logic or tradition that these little serifs actually draw your eye across the page and we all read left to right. Only problem is we don't read linearly. We actually read forward and back to look for patterns. So that's kind of bogus. What is true is that on computer screens of low resolution, which means most of the screens, except for maybe your late model iPhones, sans serif typefaces are easier to reproduce because these little serifs require resolution that you don't have. So they look great in print, but not so great on the screen, unless you're using something like Adobe Acrobat, which we are here, because it is resolution independent. So it doesn't matter how much I blow this up, it will zoom in and you'll see more and more detail of these different kinds of type. But for the most part, screens don't have good resolution. Okay? Okay, measurements. How do we measure things? Well, there's all kinds of obscure and different types and ways to measure things. The most standard one you'll find in Word and InDesign and those kinds of things is the point. And the point basically equals 1/72 of an inch. That's not actually true. It's a little bit more like 1/72.7272 repeating. But computers like to round up in the early days, so it's become, at a computer level, a point is 1/72 of an inch. Now there's all kinds of other measurement systems. This is a simple one. You could measure things in inches. You could measure things in didos. You could measure things in all kinds of picas. There's all kinds of different ways to do it. And many desktop publishing programs like InDesign will let you set that up. Points is common. Word uses points. So just think 1/72 of an inch, 72 inches to a point. If you want 1 inch tall X height text, 72 points is going to get you there pretty much, if everything is also working. But the point size takes into account the total height of the ideal typeface from descender to ascender, and although it's well defined, there's a wide historical latitude in the corresponding type sizes. Okay, so though all computers have done a lot to make things standard, different typefaces have different corresponding heights, even if they're designated the same size, based on what the designer wants. Okay, so if you look at this little illustration down at the bottom here, the ideal height of the text is from above the T there to below the G hanging. That's the descender, right? So above the ascender and below the descender. Now, what are they ascending and descending on? The height of an X in the typeface. That's called the X height of the typeface. And guess what? Different typefaces of the same absolute height have different X heights. And that's where our perceptions come in, right? So look at this. These are both 18-point typefaces. Helvetica Narrow 18-point and New Order Engraved 18-point. Which looks bigger? Well, Helvetica Narrow does, because the X height is much higher. And I'm sure you guys have all had the experience in Word or on the Mac or in the Windows going from Times New Roman to Arial. 12-point, 12-point. Arial 12-point looks way bigger than Times New Roman 12-point. And that's mainly because it's a sans serif typeface with a huge X height. Okay, so not only can you not count on a typeface being exactly the same size, right? You have to look at how its spacing is designed and all those kinds of other things. And that's what this other page talks about, right? How things are laid out in grids and how, different programs will help you lay things out in grids. Word is not a good one here. Leading, not leading, leading, right? Because people used to put lead in between rows of type on the old printing presses. And that's the vertical white space between lines of text. It's never mentioned. It's never measured in spaces. So nobody ever says double space this book. Okay, it doesn't mean anything. You have to tell them in points how much leading you want. And here's an example of what it looks like. This is 11 on 2. That's sort of a standard amount of white space vertically for the type size. This one has no leading, right? And it's kind of hard to read. And this one has probably too much leading. Again, we're getting into that white space and the gestalt of how type goes together. These lines are starting to float away, but note that it's easier to read a little bit too much than a little bit too less. Okay? So a little bit too little doesn't work. You probably wondered why wingdings is called wingdings. It's because it's filled with dingbats, these little icons that predate emojis and emoticons. They are actually part of the computer character set, but they've always been part of the typographer's toolbox in being able to draw attention to things, in being able to have bullets. Okay? Kerning is the ability to actually change the horizontal space in between letters, right? So how you set up the space between these letters affects, well, the professional look, but also how easy it is to read. So look at Western Digital Controller here. Doesn't it look kind of loose? Like, doesn't the W and the E look like there's an enormous amount of space there? Well, it does, because of the way W works when it's next to an E. So you actually have to bring the negative space in. And that's what programs like Adobe InDesign will do when coupled with real typefaces from Adobe. Notice how much closer these are now based on their optical character. DI is another one where you get a lot of space normally, or CO, but it needs to be tighter, right? To look right. Now, you don't know unless you've designed things that the N and the T here are too far apart, but you do know it. The ROL looks terrible there. And if you had to read a whole book like that, you quickly wonder what's wrong with it, right? In actual fact, there's nothing wrong with it, but this looks a lot better. And if you have to set type like that for a report or something like that, I urge you to get a good program and not Microsoft Word, and get good get good type as well, not just the stuff that comes with the computer. Okay? What's good type? Adobe type is good type. Okay? So go to adobe.com and you can get all the type that you need. Okay. So that wraps up this quick lecture on visual and graphic communication. Like I say, you can go to the course website and look at the Adobe Type Primer if you want even more information on typography. It's not a bad thing at all. And I put it out there. It's free. And you can have a look at all of the different terminologies and statistics and specifications for type. As always, questions in the class, in the e-class, and I will talk to you later. I will post something very soon now about the midterm when it goes up at the end of this week. And I hope you have, whatever Halloween's going to be, I hope you have a spooky one and enjoy the full moon. Hopefully we can see it. Okay. Bye, folks.